Let me start by saying I do not hate or even dislike any group of people of any kind. What I dislike is prejudice, racism, and bigotry, or unkind characterizations of any religious, ethnic, or national group. That being said, I'm going to tell you about the Middle East through my experience. I'm going to tell you my life story. You heard an introduction about my professional life, but I'm going to tell you tonight about my experience, my opinion based on my life of the Middle East and what I went through and what the Muslims and the Palestinians did to my country. And I'm going to let you make your own conclusion of what I have to say. A lot of people, when they hear about the Middle East, they think the Middle East is made only of Muslims. When they hear the word Arab, they think all Arabs are Muslims. This is not necessarily true. I am a Christian Arab. In the Middle East, there are two countries that are non-Muslim. One, the Jewish state, which is fighting for its survival and existence at this time. And the other one is named Lebanon. And it was the only Christian country in the Middle East before the Muslims of Iran, the Christians, took over the country. And they are controlling it right now under Syrian occupation. When Lebanon got its independence from France in the early 40s, we prospered. We built the country. The majority of the country, the majority of the Lebanese were Christians. The Muslims were the minority. We are the descendants of the Phoenicians, so we were good in commerce. In a very short period of time, we made Lebanon, Beirut, the Paris of the Middle East, the banking capital of the Middle East. That's where all the Muslims and all the sheikhs, all the royals from the Arabic countries came to party and have a good time because my country offered them the westernization that their countries forbid. Even though I was raised in a Christian country, my country was very much under the influence of its neighbors, the Arabs. The Lebanese were trying to please their neighbors, the big Arab countries. And even though we did not have any enemy and we did not concentrate on building our military, we just concentrated on the commerce, we kind of more or less followed the Arabic propaganda that the rest of the Arabs were saying. And even though I was a Christian, I was born into a Christian family. My mother and my father were married for 22 years. They were unable to have any children. And my mother was 55 years old and my father was 60 when I was born. Thank you. As an only child, I had the ideal childhood, being worshipped by two mature adults who looked at me as a miracle from God, who were so thankful for being blessed with a child. And even though I was raised in a Christian country, to Christian parents, I went to Christian private schools. And even in my Christian private school, in our Bible class, we did not study the Old Testament. I knew nothing about the Old Testament. We were told that that's the enemy's book, it's the Torah, it's for the Jews. It wasn't even called the Bible. We only studied the New Book of the Testament. On television, all we watched was propaganda against Israel. I was taught that the Jews were evil, they were barbaric, they were demon-possessed, they were the source of the problem in the Middle East, and the only time we will have peace in the Middle East is when we kill all the Jews and drive them into the sea. That's what I watched on television. That's what I heard on the radio. That's what the society taught. We Christians, as we concentrated on building our country, we concentrated on education. Education is very important to us. So, because education is very important, we didn't have a lot of children. We get married to one spouse until death do us part. And from the time we get married, we have 2, 3, maybe 4 children. And from the time they're born, we concentrate on giving them a good education. We think about what college we're going to send them to, what type of lifestyle we're going to give them, how are we going to be able to feed them. The Muslims, on the other hand, are allowed to marry up to 4 wives at a time, not in a lifetime. So they have a lot of children out of every wife. And that shifted the population in Lebanon because we became the minority and they became the majority in a very short period of time. The most famous Muslim in the world today is Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden is 1 out of 53 children. He himself has 27 children. Between father and son, they have produced 80 children. How many of you, my friends sitting in this room tonight, have produced 53 or 27 children each? I doubt any of you, unless you're Muslims. At that time, we didn't even know what the word jihad meant, because we Christians minded our own business. We didn't care about anybody else. We didn't want to offend anyone. We didn't want to hurt anyone. We helped the Muslims. We looked at them as colleagues. We looked at them as friends. We looked at them as business associates. They did not. They looked at us as the enemies, as the infidels. We stopped traveling. After 1970, we used to go, I lived in the south, and my parents, the whole family lived in Beirut. And we stopped traveling. We used to go spend Christmas and Easter at my uncle's house in Beirut. And I would ask my parents, how come we're not going to Beirut for the holidays? And my father would give me some line, oh, well, we decided to stay home this holiday. And you have to understand, home meant me with my mom and my dad, two mature adults. It wasn't fun. Well, the rest of the family was down in Beirut. But the reason we stopped traveling was because Muslims started checking up checkpoints on the side of the roads. And they would stop cars. And they would get people out of their cars. And they would look at their IDs. And in the Middle East, you are classified on your national ID if you are a Muslim, a Christian, or a Jew. So when the Muslims would get the Christians out of the car and realize that they are Christians, they would shoot them in cold blood, the whole family. The word spread very fast, and we became prisoners to our homes and cities and towns. The Muslims strengthened, and in 1975, they declared jihad on the Christians. And they started massacring city after city, town after town. The Moor, one of the biggest cities in Lebanon, had the biggest massacre. They killed thousands at a time. The atrocities that they were able to do was unheard of. We were stunned. They would walk into a bomb shelter and see a Christian mother and a father and a little baby hiding in the bomb shelter in a corner. They would take the baby, tie one leg of the baby to the mother and another leg to the father, and pull the parents apart, splitting the child in half. I had a very dear friend who was completely mentally disturbed. And the reason why she was mentally disturbed is because they made her slaughter her own son on her lap. They tied her to a chair, tied her son to her lap, put a knife to her hand, and made her slaughter her own son. They used to walk into the churches, urinate and defecate on the altars, and use the Bible as toilet paper. All this was going on as the world watched, and no one cared, and no one understood. No one understood. And they continued doing this. They started taking over the military bases in Lebanon. Well, I lived in South Lebanon. And as the Muslims took over all the military bases, there was one military base left in South Lebanon in the hands of the Christians. It was 50 yards above my house. And they started shelling it. They missed the military base, but the multiple rockets landed at my home, bringing it down, just like the World Trade Center, on a much smaller scale. And I was buried under the rubble. And I was wounded. And I still have shrapnels in my body and the scars to prove it. People walk around with numbers on their arms. I don't know if there are any of you here who are Holocaust survivors. But I have my number that I look at every morning and every night and every day I take a shower as a reminder of the hatred that can exist in the world today. I was wounded and buried under the rubble because the shrapnel cut my major artery in my arm. And they couldn't get me to a hospital. I was wounded at 9 o'clock at night. They couldn't get me to the hospital till 8 o'clock the next day. I was on my last breath. And I ended up in the hospital for 2.5 months. And I would ask my parents, laying in a hospital bed, 10 years old, why did they do this to us? And my parents would tell me, because we are Christians. We are the infidels. The Muslims want to kill us. So I knew ever since I was 10 years old that I wanted dead by the Muslims simply because I was born a Christian. After 3 surgeries, I was released and I went home. And home was no longer the home that I left, the home that I knew. Home became a bomb shelter, 6 feet underground, with no electricity, no water, and very little food. When we went into the bomb shelter, we thought the fighting is going to stop and, it's just a 2-3 week thing. We slept in cardboard boxes because my father was a businessman and he used the bomb shelter as a storage room. Well, after 2-3 weeks of sleeping in cardboard boxes, we realized we are in for a long haul. So we brought 2 mattresses from our garage and we put it in the bomb shelter. Meanwhile, the Palestinians and the Muslims surrounded us to slaughter us. And we knew how we were going to be slaughtered. We knew what to expect from the Muslims if they got their hands on us, and the Palestinians. But to our back was Israel. The border was behind our town. So we were either going to be slaughtered by the Palestinians and the Muslims, or we go to the Jews and beg for help. The Jews, the enemy, the barbaric, the demon-possessed. But we knew of the 2 evils, we knew the Jews are not going to kill us. Because after all, we had more shared values with them than we had with the Muslims. So a few people from my town crawled in the middle of the night and waved down an Israeli jeep, an Israeli patrol, and begged for help. Israel said, I'll help you out. I'll keep you alive. And Israel started coming in the middle of the night and bringing ammunition to the Christian men fighting, and bringing food to the militia to help them stay alive, and bringing milk to the children, because the Muslims and the Palestinians cut off everything. We couldn't get any food supplies or anything. Our only lifeline became Israel. Israel would take the Christian men to teach them how to fight, because the Christian men in Lebanon were only trained to get a good education. They were not street gangs. They didn't know how to fight. And you can have all the degrees, all the doctorates, and all the masters, and all the education on the wall. It doesn't do you squat when a fanatic is pointing a gun at you, wanting to kill you because he believed it's an order from God. And Israel would take the Christian men and train them in groups. We'll bring a group and take another group. And this became my life. For 7 years, from age 10 to age 17, I lived underground in that bomb shelter. No electricity, no heat. We froze in the wintertime. We would light like a campfire. My father would sneak out and get branches from trees and would light it in this small room, 8 by 10. Dark room. And a lot of mornings we used to wake up poisoned with carbon monoxide. And whoever woke up first had to drag the other 2 out and hit them on their faces to wake up so we can survive. To get some food, we would crawl out of the bomb shelter, my mother and I, and fetch some grass to eat. I learned how to eat every type of dandelion, every type of plant, every type of anything that can heal me, even thorn. I know exactly which thorn I can eat and which thorn is poisonous, and how to peel the thorns out of the plant so I can eat the leaf. And that's what we ate. And my mother would soak chickpeas overnight, and rice and lentils, so we can eat the next day. And to get some water, we would crawl to a nearby spring where my mother would put her stocking on top of the bottle to catch all the worms and all the maggots and all the rocks so we can drink the water. And we would crawl back 200 yards. It will take us sometimes hours, 6-7 hours to get back to the bomb shelter as the bullets were flying, passing our heads. It's a very amazing thing to live under a sniper watch. You've seen how the snipers terrorized the Washington, D.C. area. The sniper was after me personally. He knew my every move. He knew how much the water is going to last me. He knew when I go out to get food. And that's how we lived. And our lifeline was Israel. And this went on for 3 years. I was 13 and a half years old one night when we got word from the military. A friend of ours stopped by and he said, tonight we're going to be slaughtered because we cannot last any longer. We had lost so many men. We could not fight anymore. The fighting has been going on 24 hours a day, 2 weeks straight. And he said, tonight, we're going to die. And if anything happens, I wish you a merciful death. And we had a half-hour ceasefire. And I put on my Easter dress that my mother had sewn for me, because I wanted to look pretty when I'm dead, because I knew no one would bury me. And I was crying as my mother combed my hair, because she didn't know what to tell me. I was telling her, I don't want to die. I'm only 13 years old. I don't want to die. She couldn't say anything. We sat in the corner of our bomb shelters and held each other's hands, my mother, my father, and myself. And my parents said, we lived a long life. Whatever happens to us is okay. If they come to kill us, we'll create a distraction, and you run towards Israel and you never look back. Thank God I didn't have to do that. The only reason we survived is because that night Israel came physically into Lebanon to protect the Christians. And that's how I'm alive today. And Israel set up checkpoints around our towns and kicked away the Muslims, so at least we didn't have the snipers to worry about anymore. And set up a few checkpoints around us. And this is how we lived for another 4 years, until 1982, when Israel entered Lebanon. And recognize how I say Israel entered Lebanon. Israel did not occupy Lebanon. And the only reason Israel entered Lebanon is because Syria had gotten involved in the war under the auspices of a peacekeeping force. And Syria used Lebanon to shell Israel. And Iran sent Hezbollah and set them out and trained them under the cover of Syria also to shell Israel. It wasn't only the war, the civil war between the Christians and the Muslim Lebanese. It was the Muslims from Libya, the Muslims from Jordan, the Muslims from Syria, the Muslims from Egypt. Exactly what's going on in Iraq today. All these people came to Lebanon to fight Israel. And they were shelling Israel, to the point where all the northern borders of Israel, the people lived in bomb shelters just like us. Their lives ceased to exist. And Israel entered Lebanon just far enough to push the Syrian artillery far enough that the Syrian bombs would not reach Israel. And they went all the way to Beirut. You know, Lebanon is a very, very small country. It doesn't take much for artillery range to reach Israel. During that, my mother became wounded by a Muslim shell as the Muslims were shelling us frantically. The Muslim shell fell in front of my bomb shelter and my mother became wounded. And we had no place to treat her but Israel, because Israel is our only lifeline. And before we left the bomb shelter, my father gave me $60. And he said, here is $60 in case you need any money. And I remember touching money for the first time in my life. Because when you live in the bomb shelter, you don't go shopping. I took the money, and we went up to the Lebanese hospital, which was a shell. It was completely bombed out. And Israel had set up 1 Israeli doctor and 2 Israeli nurses on duty for first aid purposes. So they gave my mother first aid, and they put her in an Israeli-donated ambulance. And the chauffeur, the driver, was a Lebanese driver who drove us to the border. It was a 10-minute drive. We got to the border, and the Lebanese driver walks around the ambulance to me, and he asks me if I had any money for the ambulance ride. And I said, sure. And I pull, like an innocent teenager, I pull all the money that my daddy had given me. And I show it to him, and I said, how much do I owe you? And he looked at my money, and he says, give me 30. And I gave him $30, which was half the money I had, with tears in my eyes. And I thanked him so much for driving us to the border. They put my mother into another Israeli ambulance and drove us into Israel, an hour away to the nearest hospital that can take care of my mother's injury. The Israeli driver was a middle-aged man. He treated me like his own daughter. He treated me with such love, such respect, such compassion. I was stunned. For the first time in my life, I was alone in Israel by myself, even though my mother was unconscious in the back of the ambulance. I was by myself in Israel with this man. And I was completely helpless. And I didn't know where I was going or what I was doing. And this man showed me such love and respect, such compassion. He talked to me all the way to the ambulance, all the way to the hospital, and told me that he was a doctor and he was just called 12 hours ago because he was in the reserve to serve for the war. We got to the hospital, and I took the money out of my pocket to pay him the fee for the ambulance, thinking to myself, God, if the 10-minute ride cost me $30, I am sure this money is not going to be enough. And I walked around, and I asked him, how much do I owe you? And he looked at me, and he says, what is this for? And I said, you know, the fee for the ambulance. And he said, you don't owe me anything. This is a free service from us to you. Keep your money. You might need it. And I wish your mother a speedy recovery. And I hope all goes well for you. And I looked at that man, and I felt so thankful. I thanked him from the bottom of my heart. I was crying. I thought to myself, what an ethical man. What an honest man. This man could have taken my money and partied all night, and I would not have known the difference. He was a stranger to me. I was a stranger to him. Yet he didn't. And I became so angry because I realized the Lebanese driver, who's a friend of the family, stole my money. He robbed me. That was the first lesson I learned about the difference between the Israelis and the Arabs. We got into the hospital. There were hundreds of people wounded on the floor. There were Palestinians brought in from Lebanon. There were Israeli soldiers brought in from Lebanon. There were Christian Lebanese brought in. There were Muslim Lebanese brought in. And I could not believe my eyes. I was stunned. I thought to myself, I can understand why they're helping me. I'm a Christian. I am their friend. But why the heck are they helping the Palestinians and the Muslims? Little did I know about the values and the character of the Israeli people. The doctors treated everyone, every person, according to his or her injury. The doctor who treated my mother treated her before he treated the Israeli soldier laying next to her, because her injury was more severe. He even insisted on bringing an Arabic-speaking nurse so I can understand everything he was saying about my mother's condition. I could not believe my eyes. They didn't see religion. They didn't see nationality. They didn't see background. They didn't see political affiliation. They saw people suffering. People who needed help. They took my mother to the 4th floor of the hospital. And we were not in the room but maybe 5 minutes. And I heard all this commotion outside our balcony, outside our window. And people were running from the nurse's station through our room out to the balcony to see what was happening. And I went out to see what was happening. And 2 Israeli helicopters had just landed bringing wounded soldiers from Lebanon. And they were taking them out on stretchers into the emergency room. And I stood at that balcony, felt sick to my stomach. I felt brokenhearted. I felt ashamed. I felt humiliated. I felt out of place. After all, these people are wounded because of the war with my country. I didn't even make eye contact with anyone because I didn't know how they will feel about me. And I felt the tapping on my shoulder. And I looked to my side. And there was this Israeli nurse standing next to me, and she says, "You are new here, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, they just brought in my mother. She's in this room." And this lady puts her arm around me, and she says, "Don't worry, we'll take good care of her. Everything will be just fine." And I broke out crying. I broke out sobbing. Because for the first time in my life, I experienced compassion that I knew for a fact my country, my culture would not be able to show their enemy. I saw the true colors of the Israelis in their most trying moments and the way they were able to love their enemy. I could not believe my eyes. I spent 22 days at that hospital. 22 days changed my life. 22 days changed the way I listened to the radio. I watched television. I believe information because I realized I was fed nothing but a fabricated lie by my government against the Jews and the Israelis that was so far from reality. I spent 22 days and I swore that one day I will be back to Israel. Because I had to leave to Lebanon to take care of my parents. I was an only child. But I swore that one day I will be back to Israel. Because these are the type of people I want to be with. These are the type of values I want to adopt. Because I knew they had something I did not even have. They were able to love and forgive the Palestinians and their enemy much more than I was able to. And I was the Christian who's supposed to love like Jesus taught. Those 22 days in the hospital changed my life. We had a Muslim woman with us in the room. And even after 10 days, the doctors would come and change her bandage and take care of her. And when they would leave, she would say, "I hate you all. I wish you were all dead." And if you could see evil, I saw evil. Because when you are unable to be grateful for the people that saved your life, there is no hope for you.